All right, so today we're diving deep into a topic that honestly sounds like it's straight out of a sci-fi movie.
Yeah, you could say that.
Human-animal chimeras. I mean, you hear that and you immediately think of like some crazy experiment.
Right. It sounds like something Dr. Frankenstein would cook up in his lab.
Exactly. But the reality is it's a lot more complicated and honestly way more fascinating than any fictional story. We're talking about actually growing human organs inside animals. And this isn't just some futuristic idea. This research is happening right now.
It really is. And, it's being driven by a very real, very urgent problem, which is the massive global shortage of organs for transplant.
Oh, absolutely. Thousands of people are on waiting lists, and sadly, so many of them, they don't make it.
Right. So you can see why scientists are looking for solutions. And chimeras, these organisms with cells from two different species, they could be a real game changer.
So hold on, I gotta ask, are we talking about literally growing like a full human heart or a kidney inside, say, a pig?
Yeah, that's the ultimate goal. It sounds wild, but the potential to save lives is, it's really huge. And to understand how we got to this point, where scientists are actually working on this, it's interesting to look at Japan and China.
Okay. Why those two countries in particular?
Well, in Japan, you have this brilliant scientist named Hiromitsu Nakochi, who has basically dedicated his career to this kind of research. He actually waited years for approval to do these chimera experiments, and he finally got the go-ahead in 2019.
So 2019 was a big year for this field then.
Yeah, for sure. That same year, a Spanish scientist, his name is Juan Carlos Pessoa, he made a lot of headlines because he created human-monkey chimeric embryos.
Whoa, hold on a sec. Human-monkey embryos. Now that sounds like we're crossing a line, aren't we?
Well, yeah, that's definitely something that's been debated a lot. The ethical questions are huge, which we'll get to that later. But it also kind of shows why China has become this sort of hub for chimera research.
How so?
Well, their regulations, they're more flexible, I guess you could say, and that attracts scientists who, might face more restrictions in other countries.
So it's like a scientific haven for research that might be considered controversial elsewhere.
Kinda, yeah. But before we get into all that, maybe we should break down how scientists actually create a chimera. Like what's the step-by-step process?
Yeah, let's unpack that. Where do you even start with something like that?
So it all begins with an animal embryo. It has to be at a very early stage of development. Then, scientists introduce human cells into this embryo.
Okay, what kind of cells are we talking about here?
Often they use what are called induced pluripotent stem cells, or iPS cells for short.
Okay, I've heard of stem cells, obviously, but what makes these iPS cells so special?
Think of them like cellular chameleons.
Cellular chameleons. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm listening.
So basically, they're adult cells that have been kind of reprogrammed. Scientists can take them back to an embryonic-like state, which means they have the potential to turn into almost any type of cell in the body.
Oh, wow. So you're saying you could take like a skin cell and turn it back into this iPS cell, and then make it grow into like a heart cell?
Exactly. And that's why iPS cells are such a big deal for chimera research. Scientists take these cells, introduce them into the animal embryo, and then with a little genetic, I guess you'd say nudging, they can guide those human cells to form a specific organ.
Okay, so it's not just like throwing the cells in there and hoping for the best. It's about manipulating things at a genetic level.
Yeah, it's super precise.
So we've got the embryo, we've got the iPS cells. What happens next?
Right. So to make sure the human cells actually have a chance to grow, they genetically modify the animal embryo. It's like making room for those human cells and giving them the right signals to develop into, say, a pancreas.
So you're setting the stage, making sure those human cells have what they need to take root and actually grow.
Exactly. It's all about creating the right environment. And then the final step, they implant this modified embryo into a surrogate animal mother. And then they just let nature take its course.
It sounds like a really delicate process, with so many things that could go wrong.
Right. And that's where a lot of the challenges come in, making these human cells actually work together with the animal embryo. It's not easy at all. It's like trying to make two different orchestras, play the same symphony perfectly in sync.
Yeah, I can imagine. It requires a lot of fine-tuning, let's say.
For sure.
And I'm guessing the ethical considerations are just as complicated, if not more so.
Oh, absolutely. This is where things get really interesting. I mean, are we blurring the lines between humans and animals too much? It raises those big questions about what it actually means to be human and how far we should be pushing the boundaries of nature.
It's a lot to think about for sure. But before we get lost in that ethical maze, maybe let's focus on the scientific side for a bit.
Hmm.
What has actually been achieved? What are some of the breakthroughs that have gotten us to this point?
Yeah, good point. Let's look at that.
Okay.
Okay. Well, one of the most impressive things that's been done with chimeras, I think, happened back in 2017.
Okay, 2017.
Remember that Japanese scientist we were talking about, Hiromitsu Nakauchi?
Yeah, the one who'd been waiting for approval.
Right, exactly. Well, he and his team, they actually managed to grow a mouse pancreas,
Okay.
but they grew it inside a rat.
Wait, so a rat growing a mouse organ? How's that even possible?
It all comes down to genetics, you
Yeah.
know. They did some really precise gene editing on that rat embryo,
Right.
and they basically tweaked it so that it wouldn't develop its own pancreas.
Oh, so they kind of made space for the mouse pancreas.
Exactly. And then they introduced these mouse iPS cells, and in that environment, the iPS cells, they developed into a fully functional
Wow.
mouse pancreas.
That is amazing. So
Yeah.
they actually created a fully functional organ from a different species.
Yep, and they didn't stop there. They went even further and transplanted that lab-grown pancreas into a diabetic mouse.
Oh, wow. And did it work?
It did. The pancreas, it functioned perfectly, and it actually cured the mouse's diabetes.
That is incredible. So this isn't just theory we're talking about.
Yeah,
It actually has the potential to solve
right.
real problems.
Yeah, it was a huge breakthrough. I mean, it really showed that this technology could actually work in practice to address the organ shortage.
Yeah, for sure. But, growing a mouse organ inside a rat, that still seems like a relatively small step.
Yeah.
What about larger animals? Like, could we really see a pig growing a human heart? Is that something that could actually happen?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And to answer that, we have to talk about some of the scientific hurdles that still have to be overcome.
Okay, yeah, I can imagine there are a lot.
Yeah, you see the rat and the mouse, they're pretty close on the evolutionary tree. When you start talking about humans and pigs now, that's a much bigger genetic distance.
Right, so the closer the species are,
Yeah.
the easier it is to kind of make those cells play nice together.
Right. It's all about what scientists call cellular compatibility.
Okay.
And that's one of the biggest challenges with this whole thing because human and animal cells, they've evolved along totally different paths. So getting them to work together to integrate and actually function as a single unit, it's really hard.
Right, so it's like you're trying to take two totally different computer programs and make them
Yeah.
work together seamlessly.
It's a great analogy. Yeah, it's like trying to merge two systems that speak completely different languages.
Yeah, for sure. So how are scientists trying to overcome this compatibility problem?
Well, genetic modification, that's one of the key tools here. It's not just about introducing human cells, it's about actually tweaking the host animal's genes to make it more receptive to those foreign cells.
Oh, so you're kind of creating a more welcoming environment for those human cells.
Exactly. You're tailoring the environment, sending the right signals, and making sure that those human cells can really thrive.
Mhm.
But it's not just about compatibility.
Okay, what else is there?
It's also about control.
Control in what sense?
Well, we need to be able to make sure that the human cells go where we want them to go in that developing embryo.
Right.
I mean, if we're trying to grow a heart, we don't want those cells migrating to the brain or the liver.
Right,
Well,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds like a
Yeah.
recipe for disaster.
Exactly. So scientists are using these incredibly precise gene editing tools, CRISPR and things like that,
Right.
to direct those human cells to the right place in the embryo and to really prevent them from going rogue.
That's fascinating. So we've got compatibility, we've got control. Are there any other big scientific hurdles that researchers are dealing with?
Well, there's also the question of how much mixing between species is even biologically possible. We need to strike this really delicate balance. Enough human cells to actually grow the organ that we want, but not so many that it kind of overwhelms the animal's own development.
Right, so it's kind of finding that sweet spot
Yeah.
where you have enough to work with, but not too much.
Exactly. And this balancing act, it gets even trickier when you move from smaller animals like mice and rats to larger animals like pigs.
Right, because pigs have a much longer gestation period.
Right, exactly. So there's more time for things to potentially go wrong.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Huh.
It sounds like there's still a lot of basic research that needs to be done before we see this technology being used to grow human organs in pigs or other large animals.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say, but there's definitely a sense of optimism.
Yeah.
The rat mouse pancreas experiment that was really a game changer. It proved that this technology can work.
Yeah, it definitely feels like we're on the verge of something big here, but of course, no conversation about chimeras would be complete without addressing the ethical elephant in the room.
Oh, absolutely. That's where things get really interesting and complex.
Yeah.
We're basically blurring the lines between species, and that raises some really profound questions about our relationship with the natural world and even what it means to be human.
Right. I mean, those are big philosophical questions.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dive into those ethical considerations.
Yeah.
What are some of the main concerns people have about chimera research?
Well, I think one of the biggest concerns is the idea that those human cells could somehow influence the animal's brain.
Okay.
Maybe give it some degree of human-like consciousness or cognitive abilities.
Right. It's like you're creating a creature that's part human, part animal.
It's that Frankenstein idea coming back to haunt us.
Exactly.
And while scientists are working hard to make sure that those human cells stay in the target organ,
Right.
and don't migrate to the brain or other sensitive areas, it's definitely a concern that we have to take seriously.
Yeah. And what about the welfare of the animals involved in this research? It seems like they're being used as living vessels to grow human organs.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really important point. It raises questions about whether this research is exploiting animals for human benefit.
So it's not just about the potential risks to humans.
Yeah.
It's about our ethical obligations to the animals.
Right. It's about finding that balance between the potential benefits of saving human lives and the potential harm to these animals.
Yeah, very tricky balance, for sure.
Hmm.
So are there any guidelines or regulations in place to address these ethical concerns?
There are, yeah, although they vary a lot from country to country. Like in Japan, for example, they have very strict regulations about the types of chimeras that can be created and how long those embryos can be allowed to develop.
So it's a pretty tightly controlled field, at least in some places.
Yeah, but the whole regulatory landscape, it's still evolving, and there's a lot of debate about how to find that right balance between fostering scientific progress and making sure that this research is done ethically.
Right. It seems like this is a conversation that needs to involve not just scientists, but ethicists, policymakers, and the public.
Yeah, for sure. It's not just a scientific issue, it's a societal issue. We need to have open and honest discussions about the potential benefits and risks of this research and decide as a society how far we're willing to go.
Absolutely.
Huh.
I think it's important to remember, though, that at its core, this research is driven by a very human desire to alleviate suffering and to save lives.
Right. The ultimate goal here is to give hope to people who are desperately waiting for an organ transplant.
And as with any powerful technology, there are both risks and rewards that we have to carefully consider.
Absolutely.
But before we wrap things up, I'm curious about the bigger picture here. Have humans always been fascinated by this idea of blending different species?
It seems like the idea of chimeras, it's not new at all. It's been around for centuries in mythology and folklore and literature.
Right, all those ancient myths and stories.
Yeah, it really captures our imagination.
Yeah, but it seems like the line between myth and reality is getting blurrier and blurrier with this research.
Definitely. I mean, we're at this point now where we have the technology to actually manipulate the building blocks of life.
It's pretty mind-blowing.
Right. And it raises all these questions about what's possible, what's ethically permissible, and what it even means to be human in this age of incredible scientific advancement.
It really is amazing to think about how something that, used to be just a story
Right.
is now becoming real.
Mhm.
And we've been talking about chimeras mostly in the context of organ transplantation.
Right.
But I bet this research has implications that go way beyond that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The potential applications of this technology are huge. I mean, imagine using chimeras to create better models of human diseases.
Oh, okay. So instead of using animals that don't always perfectly mimic human biology,
Yeah.
you could have these chimeric animals that have
Right.
humanized organs.
Exactly.
That could give you a much more accurate picture of how a disease works.
Yeah, it could totally revolutionize drug development and testing, make it faster, safer, and more effective.
Wow. And could you also use this to study like environmental toxins
Yeah.
or even the aging process?
Right. All sorts of things.
The possibilities seem kind of endless.
They do. It's really exciting, but it
Uh,
comes with a lot of responsibility, too.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the more powerful the technology, the more careful we have to be.
Right. We need to make sure that we're developing this technology responsibly. We need strong ethical frameworks, clear guidelines, and we need to keep having those conversations with the public about how to use this technology wisely.
Absolutely. With great power comes great responsibility.
Exactly.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the science behind creating chimeras to the really complex ethical questions that this research raises.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating conversation.
It really has. And, we've talked about the amazing breakthroughs, the challenges that still lie ahead, and the potential benefits and risks.
Right, and I think it's safe to say that this research has the potential to completely change medicine and our understanding of biology.
Yeah. Yeah, and even challenge our ideas about what it means to be human.
It's a pretty incredible journey that we're on, filled with both promise and uncertainty.
Well said. Well said. Thank you so much for joining us today on this deep dive into the world of human-animal chimeras.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you learned something new and that you're leaving with a lot to think about.
Yeah, keep those questions coming.
And as always, we encourage you to stay curious and to keep exploring the amazing world of science.
Thanks for listening.